Hey everybody, and welcome to another 90s nostalgia trip, where today we'll be taking a look at a series of books that not only helped myself, but countless other 90s kids discover classic horror literature. It's a series called Great Illustrated Classics that essentially retooled and repackaged some of the most iconic and popular literature of all time, but for a younger generation. Classic stories that were already widely known and highly regarded around the world, but would otherwise be completely lost on younger readers, for the simple fact that such books were pretty far out of the realm of understanding for most kids. Books that were simply just too adult for younger readers to really appreciate. And that's where Great Illustrated Classics came in. Released by Waldman Publishing under their Baronet Books imprint, there are about 69 titles released in this series. Iconic stories such as Frankenstein, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, The Invisible Man, Dracula, Black Beauty, Treasure Island, The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, The Call of the Wild, Moby Dick, and many other novels that younger kids might have otherwise not been exposed to or interested in until much later in life, if at all. With these retooled versions, the language was simplified to make the stories easier for kids to understand. The books would also include illustrations throughout, not unlike the sort of style you would find in a graphic novel. The cover art on these books was also just incredible. It's the kind of thing I would gladly hang up on my wall. Now, as you can see in the books that I have, unfortunately my obsession with coloring in black and white pages was in full swing during this time in my life. Now, of course, over time, there would be some who would question the notion of altering or simplifying such classic literature in any way, which I can honestly understand to a degree. It brings up the question of what really makes a classic a classic. If we're willing to change the language of an author to suit the knowledge or education level of a child, are we actually just taking away what makes those stories what they are to begin with? In my personal opinion, I love these books. I only physically owned 3 of them, but those 3 helped introduce me to what would become some of my favorite stories ever, in my personal favorite genre. I remember the first time I came across Great Illustrated Classics version of Bram Stoker's Dracula while shopping at one of the all-time great nostalgic happy places, Waldman Books. I remember being fascinated by how different the character looked on the front cover to what I had known from the 1931 Universal film starring Bela Lugosi. This was my first time realizing that there was so much more to explore with these classic stories I had already come to know and love. Honestly, I'm okay with Frankenstein being simplified if it gives someone the chance to be easily introduced to a story or a genre they may come to develop a love for someday, much like I did. Reading a simplified version of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde at a young age is fine with me, because when the time came for me to experience the real deal in all its glory, I was far more interested and invested in a story that had already become a part of my life in some way. In other words, it became nostalgic. Something associated with a simpler time in my life. It made me feel like I had graduated to the more complex version of the stories that I had already been able to develop a fondness for. And honestly, many of these stories contain some pretty adult moments and ideas that would be completely lost on a younger audience anyway, so showing them the full-fledged adult versions would most likely end up not having a real impact at all, leading to them possibly not having any real interest in diving any deeper into these stories at an older age.
2 thumbs down.
But Lucy, Black Beauty is a classic.
It would have been better if the horse had 2 heads.
I think as long as we're careful to preserve the core of classic stories and classic literature, then giving kids a bit of a toned-down, less complicated appetizer is okay with me. Especially considering most schools would spend hours dissecting and breaking down every single sentence of a book either way. At least that's how they did it when I was in school. For me, it was these books, as well as the classic monster films of the golden age of horror, or the 1920s through the 1940s. You could certainly make the argument that the film versions of Frankenstein, Dracula, The Invisible Man, and so on are also not entirely accurate to the source material. Most people are fully aware of that, but those films are still considered iconic nonetheless. We don't discount the impact of the story based on the format it's told, but based on whether the core foundation of the story remains intact. I think it all boils down to another person's interpretation. We don't always have to throw people into the deep end with stuff like this. If a kid likes scary or creepy stories, show them an abridged version of an all-time classic, like Frankenstein. And when they're ready, they'll be all the more excited to experience what I'd call the director's cut, or in this case, the author's cut.
Are you sure, Lucy? Frankenstein is a classic as well.
Yeah, but this one's got a monster.
I honestly just wanted to make this video because I wanted to show some love for something that I never really hear anyone give love to. It's kind of what this whole channel is about. These books played a big role in introducing me to a world of storytelling, which has blossomed into a passion that I hold very close to my heart. So if you come across any of the books in this series, I'd love to hear what your favorites were down in the comments. I love hearing about your memories of these pieces of nostalgic history and how all of these things inspired you in some way or helped shape the person you grew up to be. So with that being said, today was just a quick little retrospective on something I loved, and I look forward to many more of these 90s nostalgia trips in the near future. If you enjoyed the video, be sure to hit that like button, and I hope you'll consider subscribing to the channel for much more 80s and 90s content to come. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.